What's up, witches, and welcome to Salem, the weirdest place on earth. Today we are getting ready for the oncoming autumn by having a look at 5 of the more notorious haunted locales in the Witch City. To appear on this list, a location had to meet 2 criteria. First, the history surrounding the purported haunting has to have been genuinely fascinating, and second, every single location on this list you can still visit today. Please do take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified when our witchy goodness makes its way to the YouTube. Now get your EMF readers ready and your proton packs primed. Let's get spooky, witches. Are starting this list off right with Salem's official haunted bookstore, which in a town filled with shops that claim to traffic in occult knowledge, how people believe that consumerism and hidden knowledge play so nicely together is beyond me, is saying something. Wicked Good Books is a quiet, unassuming little shop on Essex Street that most visitors to Salem will likely recognize. The shop maintains a nice collection of local books and never fails to organize its window dressing in exactly the way you'd want a New England bookstore to do it. Oh, and it's super haunted. Guests and employees have both reported instances of books flying off the shelves. Now, this isn't an entirely new phenomenon for Wicked Good Books either. The shop was formerly called Derby Square Bookstore and was rather infamously known for its floor-to-ceiling stacking system. Even in that store's 40-year run, there were reports of hauntings about. When the Derby Square Bookstore finally closed its doors, local lawyer Denise Kent stepped in to open another bookshop in its place. During the renovation process, Kent called in renowned paranormal investigator Ron Kolek of the New England Ghost Project fame to check out the recently discovered tunnels beneath the shop in an effort to determine if there was indeed any support to the long-held local belief that the building was haunted. Kolek returned quote-unquote convincing evidence of human remains as well as 2 supposedly entombed runaway slaves. Now, I did look around for some kind of documented evidence of Kolek's hunt, but I had trouble finding any, so if you do happen to have some primary sources, photos, newspaper articles, whatever, about this particular event, please do let me know in the comments below. I would be fascinated to check it out. Speaking of hidden chambers and basements, Bunghole Liquors is not just an irresistibly amusing thing to say, it's also a rather popular spot down by the water in the Pickering Wharf area, but before this liquor store was a hole for bung, it was a hole for cadavers. It served as a funeral home for some time, most notably during the Prohibition era. Now don't get me wrong, I like a stiff drink every now and then, but I'm not sure I would go to the lengths that Prohibition-era Salemites did to get one. Granted, they had to. With limited access, the owners of the funeral parlor decided to run a sort of tavern out of the basement. This was quite grossly the exact same spot where bodies were embalmed in preparation for their ultimate rest. After Prohibition was lifted and the parlor received its second liquor license, one of the original owner's relatives, who was actually a priest, suggested that the now governmentally permissioned liquor spot adopt the name that locals had taken to calling it during the Prohibition. You know that little hole in a barrel, like a barrel of whiskey or like a cask of whiskey, that little hole? That thing was called a bunghole in 1930 slang, and it commonly became shorthand to refer to the parlor without any interested parties knowing what the heck you were talking about. So instead of saying, yo, Brian, let's meet at the funeral parlor later and drink whiskey next to corpses, you could simply say, hey, bro-bri. Bunghole later? Question mark? These days, shoppers at the Bunghole claim that a female spirit and black cat both haunt the establishment. Perhaps they are the spectral remains of frequenters from the Speakeasy era. Or maybe the black cat could have been a stowaway from a recently docked pirate ship. Oh, you didn't know that Salem had pirates? Oh yeah, totally did. Speaking of which, one of those incredible areas that tourists don't generally explore when they come to Salem is the town's world-famous maritime trade industry. I know, it sounds really boring, but honestly, it is a really big, important, and pretty fascinating topic, way bigger than I can get into in this video, but here are the highlights. Following the Revolutionary War, many of the burgeoning seaport towns on the East Coast were financially decimated, totally blown apart by the war. Now, this was not true for Salem. In many cases, Salem's early maritime merchants actually came out richer than they were before the war. The reasons for this are pretty numerous, but a large part of it is definitely owed to Salem's natural harbor being absolutely perfect and a healthy spirit of industriousness being totally woven into Salem's cultural fabric from the very beginning. So after the war, many international traders were eyeing Boston as the most likely Massachusetts trading hub. The burgeoning Salem maritime elite needed a big plan to get them to avert their gaze toward them, and they needed it really quickly. Luckily, their ports were positively stuffed in Salem with armed trading vessels from the war. Thus began an era of maritime trade and privateering, which you could also call legal piracy, that vaulted Salem into the ranks of serious international trade player, competing even with the likes of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In this era, the whole Pickering Wharf area became an infamous red light district of sorts. The reason why is pretty obvious. It's a long stretch of businesses and houses right by the ports, and as we've already discussed, Salemites are industrious like nobody else. So with the swell in privateering and an unending flood of incoming travelers from China, India, Sumatra, and Arabia, as well as whatever American ne'er-do-wells happened to have found their way to the Salem ports, Derby Street and the Pickering Wharf area, their businesses shifted to seedier enterprises to try and capitalize. One such establishment is present-day Mercy Tavern. Now, a few years ago, Mercy Tavern was called In a Pig's Eye, and the patrons of that place claimed to often hear disembodied voices, to see sea captains disappearing into walls, and be shocked by sudden, untraceable screams. Mercy Tavern is even reported to be linked via a secret network of underground tunnels that pirate-era Salemites would use to traffic illicit goods and stolen people from Salem proper to the oceanfront in an effort to whisk them out to sea on some dark vessel. Jeez, what is it with Salem and secret tunnels? Many tourists' first indication that Salem's history might have a bit more to it than witches alone rests at the intersection of Essex Street and Hawthorne Boulevard. Now, this particular spot has three historically fascinating spots, all within a few block radius, and each come from a wildly different era of Salem's past. You got Crowhaven Corner right there on the edge, one of the most notorious and historically rooted, I suppose, witch shops in Salem. But then within a few paces of Crowhaven Corner are our final two haunts for this video. Our second to last one reportedly inspired the following passage, an abridged performance of which I now humbly beg your indulgence for. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. "Villains!" I shrieked. "Dissemble no more! I admit that ye tear up the planks! Here is the beating of his hideous heart!" You're welcome. Edgar Allan Poe was inspired to pen the famous Telltale Heart based on the murder of Joseph White at the Gardner Pingree House in Salem on the night of April 6th, 1830. The house is very much still a major part of the Salem scenery due to its location, so if you've been to Salem, you've likely seen this place, and if you've taken a ghost tour or two within the past, you might have even heard of the gruesome assassination that occurred within. On that early April eve, the 82-year-old sea captain and former slave trader Joseph White was asleep in his bed when a man crept in through a downstairs window and silently made his way up the stairs to the bedchamber. There he bludgeoned White to death with a club-like weapon fashioned by co-conspirator Richard Crowninshield. Very long and fascinating story short, John Francis, or Frank, Knapp, and Richard Crowninshield had occasion to believe that if Joseph White were to die with his will having disappeared, his considerable wealth would be spread out among his surviving relatives. As it turns out, one of those was Knapp's mother-in-law. So that explains why Knapp wanted White dead. He was trying to get a little bit of the money. But what about Richard Crowninshield? Well, it turns out he was just a bastard and everybody knew it. He frequented spots of ill repute and was known locally as disreputable. The four conspirators, comprised entirely of Knaps and Crowninshields, met at the Salem Common and planned the theft of the will and subsequent violent slaying. Unfortunately for them, none of it really worked out. Frank's brother Joe attempted to steal the will from an iron lockbox before the murder, but took the wrong document, which was, as White was old and not a complete idiot, already safe in his lawyer's lockbox. But the murder went off with the wrong document in hand, and afterwards a fascinating hunt ensued, and Frank Knapp was eventually apprehended as an accomplice to the crime. Now, he rolled over on Richard Crowninshield as the principal in the murder, and therefore, based on the legal system at the time, he was meant to be the first tried. Richard was. But he found this out from a friend before his trial date could occur, and as a final insult to the legal system, Richard Crowninshield hanged himself before the authorities could do it. Now, this caused a bit of a problem at the time because the law held that the principal agent in the murder must be tried in order to pursue the accomplices, and they knew already at this point that there was at least one. Cue the legendary Daniel Webster. Now, honestly, this segment's already super long, this video is already pretty long, so I'm not going to go in depth with the whole who Daniel Webster was and why he's one of the most iconic Americans who's ever lived, but suffice it to say, his coming to this ordeal was a massive affair. He went on to deliver one of the most beautiful, elegantly phrased prosecutorial arguments in the history of my country's legal system, maybe the world's legal system, still taught today in law schools, all in an effort to try and shift the principal blame from the now deceased Crowninshield to Frank Knapp. Webster was successful, and then a few months later, both Frank and his brother Joe were hanged. So now you got 3 out of the 4 total conspirators hanged. 1 by his own doing, 2 by the courts. The final conspirator, who is Richard Croninshield's brother, was never tried for the crime. Honestly, public fervor and interest in the crime but died off with the double hanging of the Knapps. And he didn't have that massive of a part to play in the crime anyway, so people just kind of looked the other way. But regardless of one of the co-conspirators not ever being brought to justice, the murder and trial were such that the echoes of them reverberated all the way even to New York City and influenced the likes of Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was in his mid-20s at the time. Now these days, the Gardner Pingree House still stands as a reminder of the brutal slaying and almost cinematic aftermath of it. Plenty of visitors report hearing odd footsteps, doors slamming, they see strange ghostly faces in the windows. Some even claim that on a certain night in April, if you listen very closely, you can hear the thwack of the club and the groans of an old sea captain as his life slips gruesomely away. Salem is a lot like a lot of other New England towns with deep histories in that it can be difficult to draw distinctions between historical facts and lore. Unfortunately, to even begin talking about the historical reasons behind our final haunting, we have to indulge a bit of that lore. Bridget Bishop was the first victim of the Salem witch trials, and she was, to put it mildly, somewhat of an enigmatic character in 1692 Salem. Now, the next video we are doing is all about her, actually, so if you are interested, please do check back with us for a long video detailing who she was and why I called her enigmatic. Anyway, our final haunting could really be subtitled A Tale of Two Orchards. Oddly enough, for reasons I don't really understand, Bridget Bishop's apple orchard is somewhat famous in Salem because both the Lyceum, or present-day Turner's seafood restaurant, and the Hawthorne Hotel claim to be built upon the land where the apples once fell. Maybe they both were? I'm not really sure. Maybe I'll find out more as I research Bridget. Anywho, the hauntings of both of these locations begin, at least chronologically, with Bridget Bishop and her apple orchard. But in the case of the Hawthorne Hotel, she is just one of many specters that have reportedly haunted the establishment over the years. Visitors report seeing her spectral visage wandering through the halls, bringing with it the scent of freshly bitten apples. Now, she seems to favor room 612. Why that particular room? Well, I'm no numerology expert, but here's some guesses. She was hanged in 1692. There's an obvious 1, 6, and 2 right in there. She was killed on June 10th of that year, so that would be 6/10/92, which is also pretty close to 162. But this one is super interesting. If you actually add up all of the numbers in her death day, so that's 6/10/1692, you get 1708. Now, if you divide that number by 2.79, you get 612. What's 2.79, you ask? Well, it's a number that works for this scenario. Again, I'm not really an expert. But Bridget isn't the only deceased denizen of the Hawthorne. The hotel is rather famously the home of the Salem Marine Society. Now again, I feel like I'm saying a lot this video. This is a topic that's way bigger than this conversation, but for our purposes here, note that many sea voyagers have made their way into somewhat hidden alcoves in the Hawthorne Hotel, and some of these reportedly never left. Sea captains, mariners, pirates, all have been reported in the Hawthorne. If I had to make a claim towards such a thing, I suppose I would say that the Hawthorne Hotel's probably the most haunted place in Salem in terms of the sheer variety and volume of the sightings. Why is it the most haunted exactly? I'm not really sure. It certainly doesn't have as colorful of a history as some of the other places on this list. It was only built in 1925, which by Salem standards isn't really that old. Perhaps it has more to do with the venerable nature of its location and namesake. Everything about the Hawthorne, you walk in it, it just feels like Salem. It is, in my opinion, the most Salem of the Salem hotels. Perhaps its very Salemness and the transient nature of its inhabitants, both marine or otherwise, somehow create a liminal space between our material world and another, less graspable one. I don't know really, but I do know that the spirits here aren't just seafarers and apple pickers. Infant ghosts reside here as well. Room 325 is a cold spot of electrical fault, plumbing disrupts, the lights falter with no reason behind any of it. Maybe that is what's truly terrifying about the Hawthorne, the sheer variety of seemingly malevolent, inexplicable entities prowling its halls. Viewed through such a lens, one almost longs for the comfort of a known ghost. A woman in the orchard, a drunkard in the cellar, an elderly victim in his deathbed, a merchant creeping through darkened tunnels. The lens of history reshades each of these into even yet more maddening horrors, but none such as these are as chilling as the infant with no name, the slow, unexplained motion of a captain's wheel, untouched yet still revolving on its axis, the moans from nowhere going to no one. The Hawthorne Hotel has each of these and more, and wait for any and all who dare to invite them in. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more witchy goodness. Check out ToSalem.com for a boatload of images and articles and more all about the Witch City. Stay aware, witches. I'll see you next time.